What's up, y'all? Welcome into this week's episode of Around the ACC with DP. As always, I'm your host, Dalton Pence, part of the Cardinal Sports Zone Podcast Network. This show is, along with Live with 55, the OG Cardinal Sports Zone Podcast. Thanks to all of the listeners for tuning in weekly, and thanks to our sponsors for making all of the shows a part of the network a possibility for you all, the listeners slash viewers. Two things right off the bat that pretty tough to talk about. Number one, as you can tell if you're watching this, there's no guest. There will be one next week. If there's one thing that I can promise you is that we will have a guest on this show for the Miami game. You can take that to the bank. I don't know how much compensation you're going to get for it, but you can take it to the bank because it's a promise. Unfortunately, one thing I can't promise is that Louisville football will defeat Virginia on Saturday. We're hopeful. The Cardinals are favored. But Louisville's on a 2-game skid. The loss to Notre Dame was like, oh well, we were supposed to lose that game. Tough, but oh well. The loss to SMU was alarming. Defense looked unprepared. Offense struggled in situational context. And much more. Louisville lost. Officiating continued to make up new rules for seemingly the fourth straight week that Louisville plays a game officiated by ACC referees. The vibes aren't great right now, y'all. Obviously, you all can feel that. The loss to SMU has some implications on Louisville's chances of getting back to the ACC championship game. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about what's at stake versus Virginia. We'll discuss the keys to the game. We won't dive too much into what happened in ACC play because at this point it's very clear that we need to focus on one team and one team only. This team is way too talented to be 3-2. I think we can all agree on that, right? This team is way too talented. And I'm sure that you've heard on the Cardinal Sports Zone show last Sunday. You are going to hear Friday night on Live with 55, which you will have some more Virginia preview, right? You'll hear what needs to be corrected. The coaching changes, the schematic shift, Ron English and Mark Hagan figuring it out. You could have a whole show for an hour on what's gone wrong, but I'm not going to focus on that. That's not the scope of this show. I know around the ACC, it's supposed to be about the conference as a whole, right? It's more so about the implications on any given team. And we'll talk about the ACC for certain. We'll talk about the games to watch for and whatnot. But we're going to start out with the game against Virginia. Well, better yet, what did the SMU loss, how has it affected the ACC championship hopes of the Louisville Cardinals? Well, simply put, I think Louisville has to win out in conference play. It's sad to say that because it seems so dire, but that is the severity of the situation. Like, losing to SMU, a team that has a very favorable end to the conference schedule, you could see this team maybe going undefeated in conference play. Do they? I mean, I don't know. I think that they'll probably lose one or so. But they have the tiebreaker, and that puts your team at such a disadvantage because Clemson and Miami don't play each other. They don't play SMU. And the Mustangs have a very favorable year one in the ACC. It was like Louisville's ACC schedule last year, right? So you have to win the remainder of your conference games, or pandemonium has to follow with SMU losing a ton, Clemson losing multiple games, Miami losing multiple games. Like, two of those three have to go on a skid. I just don't see that happening for any of the three. Like, Miami, it would have been nice had they lost one of the final two games before the bye. Virginia Tech had them beat. California, what happened there? What happened there? I know Cam Ward is great. I know targeting was missed. But my man, what is going on? Miami is escaping every week with a win. And again, you tip your hat, you congratulate them on the win, and you move forward. But them having another loss would have been so helpful for Louisville's chances to the point to where Louisville literally has to win out in the ACC to get back to Charlotte. Yeah, it's a dire situation because Louisville's losing games that they're not supposed to, also known as SMU. I will say this Virginia game scares me a little bit because Louisville never plays well in Charlottesville, usually. Louisville is favored to win this. In the past 2 weeks, this team has come out just completely unprepared. The same questions that we asked ourselves against Jacksonville State, we had to ask ourselves against SMU, and unfortunately, nothing changed for the Louisville Cardinals. So, what I will say is that Louisville has to turn the season around with a victory against Virginia on Saturday. It's a must. It is a must because if you win, like it's not going to be the end all be all. I like to draw the comparisons to 2022. If you remember, Louisville lost to Syracuse to start the season. They lost that game to Florida State where they had a lead. And then they lost to Boston College. It was a really, really weird start to the year. But they had a road matchup against Virginia on the schedule. And if they would have lost that game, Scott Satterfield's fate would have likely been sealed. The only question is, does Louisville fire him before the season or after? Now, he won that game. And that sparked a turnaround that followed with wins against Virginia, Pittsburgh, James Madison, NC State. It saved Scott Satterfield's job. Now, he ended up leaving on his own, thankfully, but it saved his job. He was going to get another year. And as he should have. Because he got to 8 wins. He did what needed to be done. And it all started with a road game against Virginia. Now, the circumstances are completely apples to apples. I mean, Jeff Brum is nowhere close to the hot seat. Like, the seat's not even warm. It would take multiple years of disappointments to even get to the hot seat level discussion. But as it relates to this season, you can turn the season around with a win. Like, it's not going to turn around in 1 week, but you turn back into the right direction. You stop the skid, and you get back to winning football. Now, if you lose to Virginia, it's time to panic. It is. Because now, if you're one of those hypothetical people or like the technical people that like, oh, well, you can still go on a run. You can win 9 games. You can. That doesn't mean you will. And if you lose 3 straight games and 2 of those SMU Virginia, what do you see from the team outside of blind hopeful optimism, that would suggest that you beat Miami and you beat Clemson and you beat Kentucky and you beat Pittsburgh and you go on the road and you beat Boston College? Because if you lose to Virginia, that will move you to 3-3. Any conference championship hopes, gone. First half of the season, gone. Obviously, the playoff is out the window. But then you would have to have a conversation about even getting to bowl eligibility. Because you do have the tougher part of your schedule still having to be played. You lose to Virginia, you go to 3-3. Do you beat Miami? You can. Probably not. Do you go on the road and beat Clemson for the first time in a decade? First time since joining the ACC? You could. Probably not. Do you go on the road to beat a Kentucky team you haven't beaten since 2017? No matter how bad they are, they always have your number recently. And their biggest strength directly impacts your biggest weakness. They have a really good defensive line. You have a really rough offensive line at the moment. You could. Probably not. Hypothetically, you lose all 3 of those games, you're at 6 losses. And at that point, you would be required to beat Boston College, beat Stanford, beat Pittsburgh. Or you wouldn't get to a bowl game That's why this game is so important. Like, I don't think it's like I don't like calling anything like the most important week of the season because I feel like every week needs to be the most important week of the season. We desperately need to see this team come out with some fire and some juice because I don't know about you all. I got really, really tired of being at that game on Saturday, watching the SMU sideline amped up. They're juiced, they're ready to go. First play on most of their drives, they're already in Louisville territory. And Louisville's sideline just looked lethargic. Didn't look like there was much juice or fire. And that's alarming coming off of a Notre Dame loss. Now, there's reasons as to why this team lost that game, and hopefully they can be corrected for Virginia, but we're in a we're at a crossroads right now for this season. So, I won't go too much on a tangent. Let's quickly discuss the keys to victory. Number one thing you haven't been able to do is defend mobile quarterbacks. Now, Tyler Huff, Haynes King, Riley Leonard, Kevin Jennings, all four are known for being mobile quarterbacks. Anthony Calandria can get out and run. I wouldn't really classify him as a true mobile quarterback, but he was the one last year who opened up Louisville's defense to getting gashed. Like, Louisville's defense was almost elite level status until they played Virginia. And the Virginia is like they laid the blueprint out to defeat Louisville. And since then, the Cardinals defense really hasn't been good against Power 4 competition. So if a quarterback was able to run for 89 yards while still getting sacked 4 times last year, so he ran for much more than 89 yards, he could do it again this year with a better team overall at his home stadium. So Tony Elliott's team, you best believe they're going to be focusing on trying to get Calandria out in space because Louisville's defense has not been able to show all season long they can defend it for 4 straight quarters. So if you're Virginia, why would you not in turn turn around and try to exploit Louisville's largest issue? So the first key to victory for the Louisville Cardinals is containing Anthony Calandria. Moving on, one of the other big issues is the offensive line play. The tackles have been really, really rough. The 2 right tackles were the lowest graded players on the offense, according to PFF last week. Left tackle wasn't much better, and Monroe Mills is out for an extended period of time. So the Cardinals have to be better in protecting the quarterback, because if they do, you're going to be in a great position. Virginia has the 118th best passing defense. That's not good. They're allowing about 266.4 yards per game through the air. Tyler Shuck has shown to have NFL arm talent if he stays healthy, and you have to give him time, because if you do, I think that he's really going to dissect this Virginia defense, and he's going to be able to put points up on the board. So it all starts with offensive line play. The next one is sort of a situational key to victory. Louisville has kind of struggled over the past couple weeks getting into the red zone. That's the key, getting into the red zone. They've stalled out. They've gotten to midfield fairly easily, but once they got there, it's either been penalties or sacks or situational play calling that's not allowed Louisville to get in a spot to where they're in field goal range or they're in a spot where they can go for it. Because if you get into the red zone this week, chances are you're going to score, because Virginia is 115th nationally in red zone defense. It's the worst red zone defense in the ACC. They're giving up scores on about 95% of opportunities in the red zone. They've had 18 defensive drives in the red zone. 17 of them have been scores, 9 touchdowns and 8 field goals. So you get into the red zone, you're going to put yourself in a great position to succeed and score points. This is a really key game, and Louisville has to limit the self-inflicted mistakes. They have to get into a position to where, they're just overall doing things better than what they have the past couple of weeks. So I won't really break down what happened in the ACC. Actually, screw it. Let's talk about it. What happened in the ACC this week? Obviously, Louisville was the largest loser because they lost to SMU. You go and look to who might have also been one of the largest losers, and I think you would go with I think probably NC State. NC State's 3-3, 0-2 in conference play. They have been one of the largest shocking disappointments. 2 teams, Louisville and NC State, that were dark horses for Charlotte, and I mean, they've got multiple losses already. Duke got their first loss of the season. They played Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech was by far the best team that they played, and they got exposed offensively, which I could see coming from a mile away. Georgia Tech got the victory there. Stanford might be the worst team in the ACC. Virginia Tech blew them out on the road. Wake Forest went to Raleigh and defeated NC State. Still not sold on Wake Forest, but shout out to Dave Clawson's team for getting the victory. North Carolina couldn't defeat Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is 5-0. They are currently ranked. They're 1-0 in conference play. They will come to Louisville on Senior Day this season. Thomas Castellanos was back for Boston College, but they couldn't beat Virginia. Virginia 4-1, 2-0 in conference play. Pace, the Virginia running back, had 83 yards. So shout out to the Cavaliers for getting the win. SMU 2-0 in conference play. They defeated the Louisville Cardinals. Kevin Jennings had a monster day. Rhett Lashley's team was really good. Clemson didn't blow Florida State out. They opened up, it was 17-0, but Florida State was able to at least make it somewhat respectable, 29-13. And then obviously California with an ultimate choke job against Miami. They had Miami beat, but couldn't make the winning plays outside of that to get the victory. So, and then Syracuse went on the road against UNLV and won in a shootout in overtime. The Syracuse defense still really suspect, but shout out to Kyle McCord, 355 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. He threw the ball 63 times. And then Syracuse also had, I think his name is LaQuint Allen. He had 19 carries for 71 yards and 2 touchdowns. So shout out to Syracuse for defeating a top 25 team, even though their quarterback had entered the portal right before that. Let's look at the ACC slate for this upcoming week. Obviously, Louisville against Virginia, 3:30 kickoff on Saturday in Charlottesville. Some pretty interesting matchups. We'll go with our top. I won't go with top 3 because teams have bye weeks. California at Pittsburgh is a pretty interesting one. California is probably talent-wise the best team Pittsburgh will have played up until this point. They lost to Miami, a team that they should have beaten. I want to see how they can bounce back. They've shown that being on the road doesn't really faze them, considering they won at Auburn. So will Pittsburgh be able to get to a perfect 6-0 under Pat Narduzzi in 2024, or can California bounce back in their first season in the ACC? That is something to focus on. Notre Dame will host Stanford. That should be a blowout. Georgia Tech at North Carolina. I just want to see if Georgia Tech can continue to build up their resume and get closer and closer to bowl eligibility, or can Amari and Hampton and the North Carolina offense be able to bounce back and get a much-needed home win. They're 0-2 in ACC play thus far. Wake Forest is going to try to do something very improbable, and that is defeat the 10th-ranked Clemson Tigers when the Tigers come to Union Stadium in Winston-Salem on Saturday at noon. And then we'll wrap up games at 8 o'clock on the ACC network. Syracuse at NC State. If you are Louisville, you are cheering for the NC State Wolfpack to give Syracuse their second ACC loss, just as an opportunity in ACC implications. Now, that's a tough one because right now the only focus is handling business in front of you, because we've been focusing a lot on what happens in conference play, but it doesn't matter if the team doesn't win games. And Louisville's going to have to win games, and that is the main focus moving forward. This is a shorter episode. Sorry for it being so short, but honestly, not much to talk about in ACC play, especially since Louisville has just been on a skid. We're going to have Miami talk coming up next week. One thing we'll also hope to talk about as we get closer and closer to the beginning of November is basketball talk. ACC basketball is coming back, and Pat Kelsey's team has me excited. But nonetheless, beat Virginia, right? That is going to wrap up this week's episode of Around the ACC with DP. Be sure to drop any questions you have in the comment section below as we will begin the mailbag next week. Be sure to drop those questions in. Thanks again for tuning in to Around the ACC with DP, part of the Cardinal Sports Zone Podcast Network.